Patrick Smith is the foreign affairs columnist at Salon, a correspondent abroad for nearly 30 years, chiefly for the Far Eastern Economic Review, the International Herald Tribune, and the New Yorker. His most recent book, Time No Longer, America After the American Century, came out in mid-2013 from Yale University Press.
Katrina said something that makes it a lot easier for me to say something I want to say this afternoon. Pravda on the Potomac. I tend to think more about the Hudson River, but we'll leave that for another time. I'd like to answer or address the question of why things are the way Katrina describes them, and now Bob, and see if we can come to some at least tentative conclusions. My own, if not the headline, the subhead, is why aren't journalists doing their job? I tend to think the job's become more or less impossible to do, and I'll try to explain that. I want to start with the relationship of American media to power, okay? Power. Different kinds of power. You can refract this through. You can have corporate power because of the ownership structures that have arisen from the 80s and 90s. Financial power because these are publicly listed companies, right? But I'd like to leave those aside and stay with political power, right? I think American media have had an unhealthy relationship with power since 1898. No coincidence. Our first advance into the imperial adventures, right? We often say you can have democracy or you can have empire, but you cannot have both at the same time. Maybe it is so with the press as well. You can have a healthy press, or you can have imperial ambition, but you can't have both. Just maybe, okay? That's 1898. We had, in the Cold War, a big turning point. The press had a very serious decision to make for itself. We all know, or many of us, the climate that obtained during that time. I don't have any trouble. I was young, alive, but young. I have no trouble imagining how difficult these sort of decisions were, but I don't excuse the decisions that were made nonetheless. The press, as with the scholars, present company accepted, and others, ran for cover. It's one thing if you're in some kind of corporate position or whatever and you take cover because you're worried about your job. If you're a journalist, you have other responsibilities beyond the responsibilities you have toward yourself. You have civic responsibilities. If you don't want to fulfill them, go do something else. This was a very serious moment for the American press. I dwell upon it for a moment because I think the American media had a very bad Cold War, and we've never gotten over it. We've never gotten over it. We had an interim of a decade or so during which we could have tried. I say we because I was around then, hacking away. We didn't rise to the occasion. In 2001, we had another decision, not unlike the one we had in the 50s, McCarthy and all that. And we did the same thing again, right? We bent to power, we reconfirmed an already unhealthy relationship with political power, right? We repudiated any notion, I use lecturing in universities, you trot out the phrase fourth estate. You have to explain this to journalism school graduates now. They don't even know what it means. It's so antiquated, right? Absolutely no notion whatsoever as journalism as an independent pole of power with a sovereignty all its own. We bargained it away in the access game. I assume you all know what I mean by that. And in any number of other different ways, right? Ukraine, I think, is at least of the magnitude of our Cold War bad decision and our 2001 bad decision, possibly worse. I think in this period, quantitative becomes qualitative. I think the function of media in this country, we should not any longer be misled by ownership structures such as we have them. Informally, effectively, I think we're looking at a situation where American media function as some kind of state-supervised institution. If you think that's an exaggeration, I will defend it. The New York Times editors do not go to Washington, the White House, state, Intel, what have you, once or twice. You read about it. Bill Keller consults with the administration, or Jill Abrams. You read about it once or twice, that's shocking enough, and then the story goes on, you start untying the string, and they're doing it all the time. SOP. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable, and we have to ask why this is. I'm going to use a phrase that some of you may find a little offensive. I welcome all uniformed officers, but good enough they're not here to hear this. I think we are in some approximation of a late imperial phase in this country. Every time I hear indispensable country and all the rest of it, and the chest-out assertions of various senators, it tells me the exactly opposite of what it is supposed to convey. We're on our back foot. We're very weak. We don't know how to conduct ourselves in the 21st century. We have 21st century notions of, and no imaginations. I think deep in our guts, the best of us understand that. So a certain kind of desperation arises, and the narrative becomes less and less plausible. Now, combine that with the dysfunctional relationship, and that's a kind word, between the press and power, and this is what I mean by a job that's no longer doable. These people have to get out there in the bureaus in Moscow and elsewhere and advance a story, a narrative, that simply doesn't work, right? It doesn't hold any water whatsoever unless we suspend all notions of disbelief, right? So that's why I think we have in Ukraine a much, much worse situation. And I think it's why one of the major devices deployed over the last year is what I used to call in my journalism lectures, the power of leaving out, right? The power of leaving out. You cannot go to the Times and identify outright lies. I must add, very easily. You actually can, but that's not the main event. The main event is what they are not reporting. One, context. You have to be conscientiously careless, if that's not a contradiction, to omit the vast acreage of context in this Ukraine situation. These people are in Moscow. They can't put some post-Soviet context in, some post-Cold War context before that, right? They can't put some, the context of American ambition during the American century, which I described, which I consider happened was 1898 to 2001. They can't put that in. Why? Other things left out. Certain significant features, I think we all know them, the American role in the events of late 2013, early 2014, that kind of thing. I'd like to read more about the activities of NGOs in Russia. Why? Why don't I read that? You can read it, but not in our media. And And then vast aspects of the story that are kind of plotty but very interesting. The Ukrainian economy is an absolute tragedy, right? An absolute, a humanitarian tragedy. You know, the Greeks talk about a humanitarian crisis. Greece is the Klondike compared to Ukraine. If you read you've got to read the granular sort of Bloomberg commodities reporters and bond analysis and stuff like that. You know, Ukraine's paying 35% for bond debt. That's pretty bad. I've got a 2-minute note here. I'll wrap it there. I think these are the reasons we have a situation that, in my consideration, is a certain point of no return. I'll end with this thought. Alternative media, alternative narratives. I'm not quite sure I'm comfortable with this word alternative anymore, because what people like Bob Parry are doing is not an alternative to anything. The media we are discussing, they have one thing that nobody at this table has, and that is projection. They have infrastructure. They can push it out there. That's means. That's not anything else, right? That doesn't make it the primary narrative. I think we are at the very beginning, I would say, of a process whereby the burden placed on what we now call alternative media increases very significantly to the point where we can dispose of these terms and figure out another way to call ourselves. Thanks.